As has been reported on KFUG as well as other media sources, the Del Norte County Sheriff's Department is in deep trouble. The now former county sheriff has resigned after being charged with felony voter fraud. The Sacramento Bee has painted a picture of the Del Norte County Sheriff's Office as being a highly dysfunctional department. There have been reports about abuse of at least one inmate in the county jail, as well as an allegation about an inappropriate relationship between a sheriff's department employee and an underage explorer. The Del Norte County Sheriff's Office is currently being led by a lieutenant. A new sheriff will be sworn into office in June. The department has been described as being fragile and on the verge of not being able to provide 24-hour-a-day police services to the community. Since 2020, Steve Sherman has worked as a research fellow at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. He is a mixed methods researcher who investigates land use planning, policing, community development, and housing, among other topics. You can find his lead-authored research articles in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research and the Journal of Urban Affairs. Steve Sherman joins us on the news program today. Steve Sherman, we're really glad that you could be with us on the news program and really wanted to talk to you about how law enforcement, particularly law enforcement that is in real trouble like our county sheriff's department is, how a community might be able to look at this situation and perhaps use this crisis as an opportunity to build something better, to do something better, to improve public safety in our community.
I think a lot of that depends upon a few things. You know, as a rural community, you're not going to catch quite as much attention from the state. And ultimately, the state is going to have to be maybe a resource in some ways, either to support funding for just better pay or better training for officers, or also, you know, it could be used as an opportunity to start new institutions locally, either new police oversight institutions or just new practices, new ways of doing business locally. You think about new officers being hired, new leadership. Every crisis could be an opportunity, and hopefully even within the depths of scandal, there can be some sort of light that, you know, can guide you out of it.
Let me also add to our conversation that, as you know, we're in California. We're in very ruby red California, really far away from Sacramento. It's safe to say on almost every issue at best when it comes to state government here, we're an afterthought, if they even recognize that Del Norte County is part of California. My understanding is that many of the surrounding area law enforcement entities are offering far better pay, signing bonuses, those kinds of things. So on the one hand, I'm wondering how much of that kind of help we'll be able to get. And does that mean that perhaps we might have to look at what some of these new institutions could be and what that would look like in your opinion? I realize you can't speak exactly to what's happening here, but, you know, through your work and your expertise on these topics.
Well, I think that so much of the attention, and this is where I wish, this is a hole in my expertise, so much of the attention about police reform and I guess restructuring, if you want to even use that drastic word, so much of the attention about changes in policing has really been focused on the urban areas because that's where the biggest protests have been. That's where you have often, but certainly not always, more diverse communities. So you find issues of racial justice in policing, et cetera, et cetera. But I kind of do feel like rural communities have been overlooked. I'm not so as familiar with the research, but what I could speak to anecdotally in Illinois, I'm actually physically located in Illinois in the moment, though I work for Rice in Houston. It's a temporary matter. I've heard stories of, you know, police, sheriff's deputies in rural counties getting paid less than Walmart cashiers, even though they have a job that requires far more training and deals with routinely more delicate situations. Or additionally, places being so understaffed that the people they hire include people that are deeply unfit for duty. So the staffing issues are much harder. There's kind of issues about brain drain in rural areas all across the United States, and that filters into how easily they can hire quality police officers as well. So my assumption is that there's probably some pretty radical and interesting and drastic experiments in what public safety is looking like all over rural America.
I think what people want is public safety, which doesn't always necessarily mean law enforcement. At the same time, I recognize that there are situations that only law enforcement can deal with. And so I'm wondering what some of those creative approaches might be. I think cops get asked to do way too much, just in general. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree, and I think most police officers would probably agree too. Have you ever been on a ride along with a police officer?
I haven't, but I wasn't always this semi-well-adjusted great-grandfather that I appear to be today, so I have a little bit of an idea of what they're dealing with.
Well, what you find is oftentimes in most jurisdictions they're kind of boring. And there's things that they respond to a lot of mental health calls. They respond to a lot of traffic incidents. But you go through it and you think, yeah, this is something that, does it require a gun on their day-to-day work? In most cases, absolutely not. And yet at the same time, there's still sort of this desire for, at least in the public in most cases, we talk about the police abolition movement does not have widespread popular support in the United States. Oftentimes in bigger cities, politicians have to kind of thread this line where they don't want to anger their liberal constituents and be seen as patsies or apologists for police unions, but at the same time, they want to do something about crime. Now, in rural areas, you kind of don't really have an issue as much. I don't feel, at least not in most rural areas in the United States, pardon me, I just went into my car, you're not dealing with that. So I wonder what the sort of political atmosphere is, and this is where it's really coming to a blind spot in my knowledge, because I could talk most about policing in bigger cities like Houston and Atlanta and Chicago, less so in rural Northwest California.
We have an interesting community here because we're also home to California's Supermax prison, Pelican Bay. And law enforcement and law enforcement adjacent entities, including our Crescent City Police Department, Del Norte County Probation Department, prison employees, county sheriffs, have their unions appear to be really, really strong here. My understanding is that our Del Norte County Sheriff's Department is getting 70% of the county's discretionary budget. And they couldn't even, in Crescent City, approve a program to provide funding assistance for people who wanted to go to the police academy unless they got buy-in on it by the police union. So on the one hand, it's a small community, but yet these unions seem to be very, very powerful.
That's not uncommon, even in a place like Texas, for example, where the state laws are not really friendly to big labor. There's humongous carve-outs for public safety unions.
This is fascinating to me because it really does, I think, speak to the oversight about rural policing. I pay attention to one network. It's called NACOL, the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. They have a website and they have a listserv, and it really seeks to connect people that are specifically interested in this one sort of small part of police reform, which is like oversight. And it's been a point of discussion there before, like rural oversight. And what basically everyone says is something, the closest people talk about is what goes on there in Crescent City and Pelican Bay, where the major law enforcement or public safety agencies locally, they're not the police or the sheriff's department, they're the state correctional department. And that's the same in Illinois as well, certainly. And in many other rural areas in the United States. And I think there's this big question to ask about what is that relationship, right? Like, is there people working both jobs? Are there people who work both as correction officers and as part-time sheriff's deputies? Is there people moving between the departments? Do they share unions? Do they share lobbying organizations locally? Or are they just friends? And these are, I think, kind of interesting and really underexplored questions.
Well, and let me add one more wrinkle to that, and that is that we have members of our elected County Board of Supervisors and City Council who are either and or former state prison employees, and at least in one case, current state prison employee. And these are people who are actually elected to City Council and the Board of Supervisors.
I have a question. What do you feel like is possible there in Crescent City if the department is having these mountains of problems, if the sheriff's department is having, this humongous mountain of problems? Do you feel like there is, even within a relatively red-leaning county, the potential for radical reform or change of the police department? I guess now I'm interviewing you.
I think if I was going to be completely honest, I think that the possibility of that is probably very small, because I think some of it is the mindset. We had an interesting thing happen a while back. There was a bill in California that wanted to try to limit the interaction between police and young people, because more and more they're putting more and more school resource officers into public schools. And our local probation department had wanted the County Board of Supervisors to oppose that law and literally said it's an attack on our industry. And in a poor area like we are in here, it actually is an industry here to one degree or another. So there's that. There's the traditional mindset. And I guess for me, the thing that I find to be most interesting for discussion is I don't know how much people have ever had the ability to consider something other than the current system, and how you can talk about that without it immediately turning into you're only bringing this up because you hate cops and you want to defund the police.
Well, it sounds like the police have already been defunded there if the budget can't hire people.
And that's true. In fact, a former sheriff said exactly that.
This might sound like kind of a brutally real perspective, but if the community's leaders get together and say, we have a choice, that roads and schools can be funded, or we can throw more money to a department that seems to have a really sort of deep-seated cultural rot. And, ultimately I think it becomes a point of like, that's sort of the political discussion that may need to happen. One thing I wish, this is the point that bothers me in conversation with other policing scholars, but not even policing scholars, I feel like they know this already, but people who critique policing from outside of sort of the specific expertise, is that you can't speak of, quote unquote, the police in America. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States, and no other nation on this planet comes anywhere remotely close to that. No one. Brazil is second. They have about 4,000. So they're maybe on a similar scale, but it's nothing like us. And the reality of U.S. federalism is that all of those 18,000 units are essentially free agents. In Great Britain, I believe there's there's one for about every single county or territory plus Manchester and London. And that's kind of a common arrangement across the United States. It's completely, from a global perspective, it is completely bizarre that a jurisdiction like yours has its own independent police agency that effectively operates. They have some regulatory oversight, but it's not like the state is actively watching them. And so when it's something that I think people in the United States don't necessarily realize how utterly bizarre their police institutional arrangements are. And I think that right now what's happening in Crescent City is sort of you can call it the chickens coming home to roost, but it's this question of this is such a rural area that is under-resourced. How can it provide its own funds to support a standing professional police force?
This is an under-resourced community in every possible way. I guess what I'm wondering and hoping you might be able to help me with is, would there be an alternative or some alternative models of achieving public safety that don't rely so heavily on trying to provide resources to something that it seems like it's almost impossible to provide resources to?
The popular thing right now is what we call in Houston crisis intervention response teams. That on certain calls, both the less severe sort of cat and tree type stuff, but also the more severe yet like ostensibly nonviolent type stuff, so mental health crises, that you don't send out an officer, you send out some kind of trained intervention response worker. People will often say these are social workers, but they're usually not social workers, and social workers are kind of trained differently than sort of crisis response officer. But even with these sort of crisis intervention officers, there's always this big question of like, so how police are they? Because you go to respond to a call of someone with a mental health crisis, you don't necessarily know it's not going to need the police. That person could need to be physically restrained. And it's not necessarily incumbent upon a crisis response officer to be able to do that. Secondly, there's the question of a person suffering illness has legal rights that a person breaking the law does not. I could fall and break my arm and the ambulance can come, and I could say, no, go away, even though it might be a compound fracture. I can tell them to get lost legally, and they have to get lost because I still have the right to refuse medical care. I don't have the right to refuse getting into a cop car if I've broken the law, though. So people often ask for these crisis response teams to have police officers because sometimes people are having legitimate mental health crises and they are serious threats to themselves and those around them, and they don't realize it. And so there's always this big question of how involved the police are, even in these, like, quote-unquote, alternative public safety institutions. And that's a question that I have. And the second question that I have, too, is that it's not just about reforming the police. It's also about reforming 911 dispatch. And if you're a 911 caller, knowing how to send out which specific response team, either the police or an alternative response team, is incredibly difficult to know just from a little bit of information you get on a call. And so I think when it comes to reforming these police agencies or developing alternatives, these are two kind of important questions about, A, how connected the police are, and B, what's 911 dispatch's role in it?
To be able to have this sort of multidisciplinary crisis response force, if you will, you actually have to be able to have those other disciplines available, or you can't do it. I guess I'm starting to wonder, is the problem so systemic, particularly for rural law enforcement, that a lot of these models that get talked about in the media just simply are unworkable and something else has to happen?
I have a tendency to sound contrarian as people talk about police responses. Yeah, there's questions, and maybe that's the academic in me, but people say it's unworkable, but the counterpoint is that having 18,000 individually funded police departments across the United States might also be unworkable. And I'm wondering down the line if we're going to find state governments, particularly ones that have large rural jurisdictions with funding problems, which would include, for that matter, Illinois and California, whether or not state governments will actively start to think about enforcing consolidation of police services or enforcing some greater sense of oversight. My guess is that that political flight will be bloody, metaphorically and perhaps even literally, because police unions have an active lobbying wing. But if it gets to be a point where the dollars and cents start to become such a glaring problem that it starts to gain a lot of political will, perhaps even on both sides of the aisle, then who knows what we'll see. If you're going to see some kind of radical reorganization of rural policing, I think it's going to happen first in a state like Illinois or California or New York, some solidly blue state with, significant rural populations, but places where, particularly in Illinois, the rural population is just shrinking at an incredibly fast rate, probably even faster than California. So I believe I would not be surprised to see that happen.
And in light of everything that we've discussed, Sherman also pointed out
there effectively is no oversight. The Justice Department will only get involved in sort of the most severe cases. And there was a law passed during the Clinton administration, which was later kneecapped to enable consent decrees. But those usually only happen in the most severe of cases. Your Ferguson's or your Chicago in the wake of the John Birch torture cases or other big cities. I cannot recall one single instance of a rural sheriff's department having a consent decree. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been one, but I just can't think of one off the top of my head. I think it's also important to remember that most of America does live in urban areas, so of course those issues are going to be louder. But I still think that policing problems are not restricted to them, and I think I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk with y'all and just talk about a different context. And so, who's advocating for y'all, right? Like, that's actually a very serious and I think very important question. As someone who has family roots, at least in rural Illinois, it's something I think about a lot too. And the issues are pretty similar.
So, what did we learn from this conversation? The issues around public safety and law enforcement in the United States are complicated, some by nature and some by design. When it comes to addressing these issues in rural communities across the nation, we're basically off the map. Even if we wanted to talk about concepts like defunding the police and using that money to fund other potential methods of achieving public safety, well, that's a non-starter because our law enforcement agencies have already been defunded, as has nearly everything else when it comes to government-funded public services. It's why places like Del Norte County have become so dependent on grants and private philanthropy, and for some, desperately clutching at straws, hoping that high-end tourism will bring economic prosperity, or at least enough money where we could have a chance at hiring qualified law enforcement personnel, along with providing the tools and training they would need to do the job. Most people who know me know I'm not a fan of using police as school resource officers in public schools. And why do we pursue them in communities like this? Because it's one of a few places where money is available. And the larger truth to face, which is something we already know, is that rural communities have been abandoned on nearly every level possible. And that's particularly true in California, which seems to lead to the obvious conclusion that we need more than just a radical restructuring of law enforcement in rural communities and into a serious conversation about how our political, economic, and social structures can provide the resources needed for communities like ours to thrive. For KFUG Community News, I'm Mike Thornton.